Welcome to the Control of Hazardous Energy webinar. We're going to talk about how to apply the Lockout Tagout standards in a practical way. There are a lot of ways that people describe Lockout Tagout and Control of Hazardous Energy. I'm going to try to break it down and make it a little more simple and not overcomplicate things. Mind you, this is a 1 hour situation. Can't get into all the details, but this is kind of just the high level crash course on Lockout Tagout. Right off the bat, I do see a question. Will you share this recorded session? Yes. So after the webinar, you will get a follow-up email saying thank you for attending and here's a copy of the recording. If somebody didn't attend, they'll also get that. And we also post all of these on our YouTube channel. So you can always share it with anybody in your organization or friends or, I don't know, family, if you have a family like mine that has multiple people in engineering and electrical fields. And we like to talk about that kind of stuff. So it is available on our YouTube channel as well. Another thing, if you find the handout tab or button on your GoToWebinar format, it will have a copy of the slides in PDF for you to download. So you can have that as a resource as well. Otherwise, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do not hesitate. Use the question feature. I've got the screen off to the side here. That's why I keep looking over there. I just keep double checking, making sure no other questions are coming in. I'll try to address them as they come up. Otherwise, I'll catch any that I missed or maybe thought would be better to save till the end at the end. Okay, so my name is Caitlyn Wininger, and I need to get an updated headshot, obviously, but I am a CESCP, so Certified Electrical Safety Compliance Professional through NFPA, and I've been with Hazardous Engineering a number of years now, working with training programs and safety audits and program writing and all that kind of stuff. I've also done the studies side of it, but my focus is more the safety training and program writing and audit side. So first off, I just have a couple polls here. Well, only one for right now. Do you even have a Control of Hazardous Energy or Lockout Tagout program? And are you confident it's compliant and relevant to your workplace? So you should see that poll popped up now, and the question options or the answer options are yes, and that you feel good about it. No, it might be missing some aspects, or you're just simply not sure. So if you will just click one of those responses and click submit, that way I can get a feel for, who I'm talking to here, where you're at in this process is very important to know, because if everybody's feeling good about it, great, we'll just kind of highlight some things, but okay, got a good number here. Perfect. Go ahead and close this one out. So majority said that you might be missing some aspects or that you don't have one. Although 33% say you're feeling pretty good about your program, which is fantastic. Lockout Tagout has not been a new thing, necessarily. So hopefully, we can fill in those gaps if there are any. And if you're not sure, well, hopefully you find out. Okay. We do have a lot to cover in this short period, so I'm kind of booking it through this intro part, but we're going to start with the Control of Hazardous Energy regulations, the Lockout Tagout standards that you need to keep in mind, and then we'll dive into that practical application piece, some best practices, some simplifications that you can make without cutting corners, because that's also very important. Don't ever cut corners on this stuff. How to get started revamping your LOTO program. Essentially, I'm just going to give you a checklist of things that you can start on today to get your program improved. And then, of course, if there's any outstanding questions, I'll address them at the end. Okay, let's talk about those regulations. There's three main books that we typically look to. So there's, of course, the OSHA regulations, so the 1910. And then there's also ANSI. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the NFPA 70E. Because whenever it comes to electrical, there are actually additional steps for Lockout Tagout. So in OSHA, the 29 CFR 1910 subpart O and S talk about machine guarding and electrical safety, but then there's the DOT 147, which is the Control of Hazardous Energy standard. That is like the main thing that people reference whenever they're trying to build their LOTO program. There's also some additional selection and use of work practices for the electrical stuff in 333. So then there's the ANSI standard, ANSI Z244.1, which is standard for lockout, tagout, and alternative methods. So talking about like minor servicing, for example, could be discussed in that. And then we've got NFPA 70E, Article 120, which goes into detail about establishing an electrically safe work condition. So really those three go hand in hand. Mind you, there's a lot of good resources out there, but these are the main ones. So OSHA regulation is law. The other two are standard, and so you could start going down the rabbit hole of, well, is it really necessary to follow? Well, yes, because they're consensus standards and OSHA can cite them, but there is no gray area whenever it comes to the OSHA regulations, the standards that they have created. Okay, so we are liable to that standard, or held to that standard, I should say. In that, it says that the standard applies to control of energy during servicing and or maintenance of machines and equipment. So in order to service and or maintain machines or equipment, you have to be able to properly apply lockout tagout first so that nobody is exposed to hazardous energy. Normal production operations are not covered. So in other words, the quick replacements where you're not actually in the danger zone, the things like that, not necessarily what we're talking about in that portion. In that standard, though, there is a requirement for the energy control program. Again, for any servicing or maintenance where there is a potential for hazardous energy. Unexpected energization, startup, or release of stored energy could cause injury. So if that's the case, then it needs to be isolated from the energy source and rendered inoperative. In other words, whatever it is that's hazardous is blocked or removed or somehow isolated, and that it's not able to come back into service until those controls are removed. And then we've got the ANSI Z244.1, which is American National Standards Institute. It is recommended by OSHA, and it is a recognized consensus standard. Therefore, they can cite ANSI if you're not at least meeting those minimum requirements. So it's a good reference to go to just to make sure that you have safe work practices around lockout tagout. And again, very similar scope as far as servicing, maintaining, adjusting, inspecting, and jamming, setup, testing, troubleshooting. It covers a lot of different aspects to making sure that hazardous energy is understood, isolated, controlled, all that wonderful stuff. And then of course the 70E, which more people look at this and think, oh, that's electrical safety. And they kind of separate lockout, tagout, and electrical safety. But in reality, you can't really have one without the other, frankly. You have to be able to safely lock out electrical equipment to get to work, right? And if you're locking out other pieces of equipment and you're not really focused on the electrical, that's not what you're servicing or maintaining, you may still need to do the extra steps described in the 70E to make it electrically safe. We'll dive into that a little bit, but all three go hand in hand. And even in that, it has a section talking about lockout tagout programs being applicable to the experience and training of workers, meet the requirements of the 70E, and apply to basically all equipment that has hazardous energy. So to kind of summarize what's required as far as the regulations and the standards, all three have some consistencies. First off, everybody needs to be trained and retrained on a certain interval. We'll get into that. There need to be periodic inspections, review of the procedures, the employees, the written program. First of all, you have to implement specific procedures step by step. Don't skip steps, don't cut corners, make sure that there are no assumed steps. I see that quite often. You know, they think, well, of course you're going to dissipate this. Okay, but what do they say about the word assume? Makes us all look silly, so don't do that. We write it out. It's a specific procedure. And also keep in mind that there could be protective equipment or other materials needed in order to implement that lockout tagout procedure. So making sure that those are available for the worker at the time. Okay, so training is very important. That's my world, that's what I love and live in, but not always do people get trained to the specific work practices required by LOTO standards and their employer. So I'm just curious, have your workers been trained on the specific safe work practices required by LOTO standards? Yes, no, not sure. Pretty simple poll this time. Just select which one fits best and click submit. Okay, getting some answers going here. Wow, pretty good split, actually. All across the board. Which is understandable, but unfortunate, because I feel like lockout tagout, again, it's not a super new thing. So I would hope that everyone has some kind of training on it. If they have to use a lock at any point to lock out machines or equipment, they need to know how to do it properly and when not to, you know, do anything wrong. Okay, so we got most people submitted, share the results. Okay, so at the end of that, we have 50% saying yes, you've had that training, 32% said no, and then 18% not sure, which is, again, understandable. A lot of companies have lockout tagout procedures. They've got the policies in place. They've got the locks and the tags and the devices. And then training kind of goes to the wayside a little bit because, well, you know, this is a competent person and they're the only ones that are working on this piece of equipment. They know what they're doing. I get it. We like to trust our people, but we can't assume anything. We have to make sure that we're following up on the training requirements as well. Okay. Let's get into what kinds of things you would talk about in that training, which also goes into understanding how to practically apply those lockout tagout requirements. Well, first off, we just have to understand what those hazardous energy sources could be. So commonly, we've got things like electrical, mechanical, hydraulic, pneumatic, thermal, chemical, gas, active, stored, and gravity. Gravity is a very commonly overlooked one, but all these types of energy sources need to be addressed. And if there are multiple hazardous energy sources involved in one LOTO procedure, then it actually needs to be written out step by step, which goes first and how do you handle this. So first up, electrical. Vast majority of lockout tagout procedures are going to involve electrical. We run off electricity, right? So that's where it becomes a little bit more than just lockout tagout. We get into needing qualified persons if there's going to be exposure to electrical components because they have to establish an electrically safe work condition. One of those steps is lockout tagout, but then there's additional steps above and beyond. The triple check, the live, dead, live with their meter, making sure that those exposed components are actually de-energized, and then ground if necessary. Our next webinar is actually going to be a whole webinar detailing and focused in on establishing an electrically safe work condition. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but there's the basic 8 steps. Just understand if you have electrical involved, there could be additional steps that your lockout tagout program and procedures might not specify, although they should. And this is an example where arc flash and shock PPE would be needed to verify absence of voltage. It's very likely. And you know, sometimes there's other PPE involved, but this is the most common. Okay, what about pneumatic and hydraulic equipment? Well, both of those have to have that energy dissipated or relieved slowly as to not damage the equipment or, you know, cause more of a hazard because it's released too rapidly. So there has to be some kind of valve or control to make sure that that pressure buildup essentially has a chance to dissipate. And then of course there's liquid. So all kinds of liquids flowing, it could be boilers, it could be water heaters, whatever. That needs to be isolated, make sure there's no flow hazard downstream or upstream, also cooled water, very common. So a lot of those are just big valves that need to be shut off so that you don't allow that water to, or liquid to flow anymore. Thermal is a little bit interesting. So oftentimes there's electrical, maybe a gas component with this, but it comes down to just it's hot. And so if you shut it off, a lot of times you have to figure out how long it takes for it to cool off before it no longer is a hazard. Like being burnt just from touching it or being too close to it even. So things like boilers, booster heaters, sanitizers, things like that. Maybe you even need to use a temperature gun. Instead of setting a designated time, you would need to, in your procedure, say after so long, use your temperature gun and make sure it's below a certain threshold for safe levels. Chemicals and gases are also a common energy source. Those are not only harmful to individuals working with it, but they have unique potentials for things like fires and explosions and harmful fumes. All sorts of things can happen whenever you're talking about chemicals and gases. It's not just a matter of that energy being released. There are other factors to consider. So those also need to be released, drained, or ventilated properly, depending on which it is, chemical or gas, prior to locking it out and getting to work. Maybe you add that into your steps and have multiple things to consider, second person, things like that. Mechanical is a pretty common one as well, just basically moving parts, pinch points, things like that. Definitely could get caught up in something, could get, a jacket or a glove caught in a gear or your hand or whatever. Crush injuries are very prevalent still. And so making sure that those are blocked or somehow isolated from their moving parts, being able to continue moving is important. Gravity, so like lifts or presses or things like that, elevators, got to make sure those are blocked. Blocks, pins, some kind of way to keep it from coming down, because usually whenever you shut the power off, whatever's holding it up, pneumatics, hydraulics, or just gears or whatever, it wants to go to its natural resting position or the zero energy state. Maybe you can just lower it and let it be in the natural position, the resting state. But if you can't, maybe you're working underneath it, you have to make sure you block it appropriately. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick overview of some of the most common hazardous energies. Kind of sort of briefly discussed how to handle them. There are specific devices that can be used for these different hazardous energy isolation points. So do you think you have the proper devices to lock out each type of hazardous energy isolation point that you have? So valves, switches, breakers, just general locks, cord caps. I mean, there's all sorts of things. We'll touch base on those in a moment, but what do you think? Do you have the proper devices to even handle the isolation points that you have in your facility or your workplace? Okay. Getting some good responses here. Give it just a few more seconds. Okay, vast majority said yes, you have them, which is great. Like I said, I think the majority of companies have a program. They may even have site-specific procedures. They have the devices. Training is the most commonly overlooked thing. All right, very good. So let's talk about what those devices might look like. So for example, breakers, or really any kind of lock, a lot of times a typical lock, individually keyed lock, and tag are at work. It could be with a ball valve cover. It could be a cord and plug cap. You could put it on the device itself, like you see on the disconnect switch there. You've got gate valve or globe valve devices so that you can't turn the handle anymore. Butterfly valve, making sure that you can't close it and move things anymore. Breaker LOTO, those you have to be a little bit careful with. They make them. Oh my goodness, the device that you can attach over a breaker to lock it in the off position. If you don't get it just right, they can actually fall off. So just be careful with that. Make sure you practice and that you have the right type for that breaker. Blocks and pins, there's a whole bunch of varieties of those, but there's a couple examples. The key with these devices, whether you have them, for each individual person, maybe that's needed. The locks for sure are everybody's individually keyed. But the devices that go over those isolation points need to be accessible. Okay, typically I see like lockout tagout centers or boxes, and it's got everything they need in that location, and they've got a few of those spread out. Or you could do individual like toolboxes and everybody gets a set of their own lockout devices. Whatever works for you guys, just make sure that they're readily accessible for everybody. Here's some examples of those LOTO stations. You know, we've got hasps and tags available. We've got the valve covers and the cord caps and all that stuff. The one on the left, I also like to point out, this was an environment where they couldn't have the procedures posted at each piece of equipment, or it wasn't practical. And so right with the locks and tags and the devices that go over those isolation points, they have binders full of those procedures. They make it super easily, readily accessible right there for the employees. We'll get into that in just a little bit, but that's also very important to keep accessible at a moment's notice. Another thing about these LOTO stations, let's keep them outside of areas where there is all kinds of stuff going on, all kinds of hazards. So like a machine shop area, maybe kind of keep it off to the side on the wall or maybe outside the door, somewhere that they don't have to walk around other hazardous moving parts, for example, just to even get to the locks and tags and devices. I've seen some interesting situations, but just do what you can to make it easy to access. For those locks and tags specifically, because those are going to be the most common used on pretty much every LOTO procedure, there are times where you can just use a lock and no tag, a tag and no lock. It's based on company policy. You have to keep a robust decision on that though. Most of the time, vast majority of the time, do both together. Okay, so for those, they need to be durable. Okay, it can't just be some random piece of paper with your name on it. It needs to be able to withstand the environment in which they are used. It needs to be standardized by color, by shape, by size, one of the above. Same thing with the tags. They have to be some kind of uniform print and format. It doesn't matter what color you use. It doesn't matter what style you use, as long as they are single keyed locks and they're consistent. So for example, I know there's a lot of companies out there that electrical department get all red locks, and general maintenance gets all blue locks and such and so forth. That's fine as long as the other parts of it are consistent. And other side of it, they don't really care what type of lock it is, but all red locks are LOTO locks and can only be used for LOTO. That's fine too. See what I'm saying? They also need to be substantial. So locks removable only during use of excessive force. So like bolt cutters, right? You don't want to just throw a lock on there that you can easily pull and it just comes loose like it's broken, or those really chintzy, cheap locks out there. It does need to be identifiable. Have to have some kind of warning that says, danger, or danger is the key word. Do not remove, locked out, do not operate, something like that. Okay. The other thing is that it may not be just one person having to lock out equipment at a time. If you work in groups, there's a couple options. So we've got lock boxes where everybody goes around and applies their lock. Everybody watches and participates as one person applies locks to each isolation point, and then they put the keys in a box, and then everybody puts their lock on that box. So hopefully that makes sense. There's one person, they go around, they lock out all the points, and then they put those keys to those locks in a box, and everybody that has to also work under those locks locks their personal lock on the box, okay? And then that way you can't access the keys that are on the equipment, the lock on the equipment, until everybody agrees that it's safe to start up again and have removed their own personal locks. The other side of it is that you can get a whole bunch of hasps like you see on the left there or right here. And then that way, up to however many holes there are on the hasp, everybody locks out every piece of equipment, and that works too. These are also great to use for things like shift changes, because then the last person can leave their lock on with the hasp. The new person put their lock on before the last person takes it off, so that there's always control on that lockout tagout. Okay. Generally speaking, using these locks and devices, hasp, group lockout, whatever, there is a basic sequence of those procedures. First off is notify employees. Make sure that everyone's aware that you're about to shut this equipment down. Everyone that needs to know anyway. Other authorized employees in the area, affected people, things like that. Review the lockout tagout procedure. Make sure that you know exactly what needs to be isolated, in what order, how to dissipate energy, all those wonderful things. Turn off the equipment or the machine, isolate the energy. So those isolation points that you've identified, go ahead and turn those off or open those up as well. And then you apply that lock, tag, maybe have a hasp as well, just to make everything easier. Dissipate the energy. So it could be capacitors. You need a grounding strap for capacitors. It could be that you have to slowly open a valve that has pressurized air or something like that. Typically, the last step is to attempt to restart. Make sure that if you did try to turn everything back on with the locks in place, it won't. That energy will not come back on. Then you know it's safe to get started to work. And then once it's done, you check the area, you check the machine, make sure that nobody's in the danger zones, that there's no tools or equipment left, that guards are in place. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself, but there we go. Then you can remove the lockout tagout, notify employees, and turn it back on. Okay. Now, mind you, these steps are oversimplified. Really what you need are equipment-specific procedures. If there is more than one isolation point, you need to have some procedure in place to make sure people know which order to open them in. So for example, we've got LOTO procedures, minor servicing procedures. Those are two separate types. I'll briefly touch on minor servicing in a second. So these do need to be posted prominently at the equipment or readily available in the area. I've seen some people that are starting to go to the electronic version. You know, everyone has a tablet in the area or on their phone, and they can pull it up based on a little barcode on the piece of equipment. Okay, fine. As long as it's readily available to anyone that would need it, that's okay. Still, majority of people I see go ahead and just post it at the equipment. Takes out a few of those steps. It does need to define all the tasks, all the energy sources, and how to safely accomplish that lockout tagout procedure, step by step. The minor servicing is a little bit more complicated, and it's a whole different beast whenever it comes to equipment maintenance. It's not really maintenance, sorry. Interacting with equipment. I would say that people overuse minor servicing, you know, setup or changing out parts or things. You're supposed to have some kind of adapted way to, clear a jam, for example, pull out a broken piece of product that's jamming the line. Okay, fine, you can do that as long as you're not reaching in directly. You're using some kind of tool or other device to clear that jam. That's the minor servicing, most common. Okay, so for those equipment-specific procedures, the step-by-step, how to lock it out, how to dissipate the energy. Does your workplace have equipment-specific procedures available? They're extremely helpful tools and required. So yes, no, not sure. Okay. And again, this is if there's more than one isolation point. So if it's, for example, all you have is a breaker or all you have is a switch, and it's one switch for that whole machine, you turn off the electrical, you're good. There are no other hazardous energy points that you would have to isolate. Fine, you don't have to have a specific LOTO procedure for that. But if there's more than one, that's different. Okay, go ahead and close the poll. Okay, again, a pretty good split here. 55% said yes, you have them. That's fantastic. 36% said no, which if there's more than one isolation point, you might want to go ahead and start working on that. And then 9% not sure, which fair. I think we've got a few people that may or may not have too much experience with the lockout tagout based on these poll questions, which is fine. Another good reference on those here, I'm going to scooch back one slide. On those specific procedures, the one on the left, for example, red is electrical. Okay, that's across the board. We identify red isolation points as electrical isolation points. Well, we could also get little tags that say and match up with the color and the isolation number or the device number on the procedure. So for example, that procedure a moment ago, it said E1, you have to shut off blah, 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 and then you can look up and see a tag that says E1. Or pneumatic, P1. So color code, have that acronym, so to speak, to easily identify which point and which order they go in. Not required, but a best practice, I would say. Whenever it comes to getting all of this done, making sure that people have the devices and that the procedures are written and that the policy is up to date, there are different responsibilities depending on your interaction with that process. So for employees, everyone is involved to some extent. There's authorized employees, typically operators that might have to perform basic troubleshooting or maintenance personnel, of course, and then supervisors or management usually are grouped in that authorized employee role, whereas affected employees are operators such like not performing any troubleshooting or maintenance. All they do is, operate the machine. They don't work on it necessarily. Office personnel is another example of affected employees, just people who are in the area but not necessarily going to be allowed or ever need to apply a lock. Contractors also are included. They need to be authorized or they need to be authorized if they're going to be working on equipment with it shut off. They need to be able to apply their own locks, typically along with an authorized employee from the host employer, and even guests. Maybe they're not going to be applying LOTO, but they're in an area that happens. They would be considered affected even if they're not your employee. So have some kind of crash course ready to go, or double check that they've been trained on it somehow for awareness. A little bit deeper dive here. Authorized, that is a person that needs to lock out or tag out machines or equipment. They're going to perform service, maintenance, troubleshooting, replace parts or set up equipment for operations, whatever. They need to be authorized to identify those sources of energy and properly apply lockout tagout. An affected employee may become an authorized employee if needed, as long as they've completed the required training to become an authorized employee. So just because somebody says, oh, I know how to handle this, I can just go grab a lock off the wall if you've got a station and I'll do it. If they've not been trained to be an authorized employee, they're technically not supposed to do that, which makes sense because, again, we don't want to assume that they actually do know everything, because nobody does. And then we've got affected employees. Those are people who require them to operate or use equipment, but they don't necessarily perform the maintenance and servicing of it themselves. They might be in the area while that's happening though. So they essentially just have to be aware of what's going on and where the danger zones are, at what point they are required to contact an authorized personnel, because they are never allowed in the danger zone. They're never going to be the ones applying a lock, okay, or performing a minor servicing task. And then there's kind of this other group, which still fall under affected, but most of the time people miss as far as training requirements go. So things like office personnel, they don't really recognize them as needing trained for lockout tagout. However, if that affected employee does enter an area that has lockout tagout going into place, and there is a chance that they'd ever be, walking through or talking to or helping out or stumble into a danger zone, God forbid, they do need to be trained. They need to be aware of what's going on in that area and what those locks mean and who to talk to if they have any questions. So to kind of summarize the employee responsibility side, you do have to know your role, authorized versus affected. I will also note for electrical lockout tagout, if there's going to be exposed energized conductors or circuit parts, that authorized person also needs to be a qualified electrical worker. in order to verify absence of voltage with the right PPE on. Again, it gets a little tricky, a little sticky there, but you can have authorized employees that are not electrical as long as they never open up anything that exposes electrical components 50 volts or greater. That's fine. If that's the case though, if they do open up anything 50 volts or greater, they also need to be a qualified electrical worker in order to verify that absence of voltage. Little side tangent there, but also very important. Okay, so let's break down. The person who is standing by watching, waiting for the work to be done, that is an affected employee. The person who's actually doing the work, servicing the equipment, that is the authorized employee. That's the one that would be putting the lock on the equipment. And then there's this kind of other group. They are considered affected, but we don't usually think of them as such because they're not usually in the area where the authorized workers are completing their tasks. But if they ever are, remember, they got to be trained too. Awareness. Okay, and then there's the employer side. So usually management, safety department, somebody like that is going to be considered employer as far as the responsibilities. So yeah, you got to have an effective lockout tagout program in place. This includes written policies, disciplinary actions, which nobody likes to talk about, but it's very important, training, having an effective program, and having effective procedures. A lot of times the disciplinary action boils down to if you don't lock it out properly, knowingly, that's a problem, right? You're going to get retraining, you're going to get potentially some job scope restrictions. And I see oftentimes if somebody removes a lock without authorization, that's not their lock. I mean, honestly, frankly, a lot of times that is immediate dismissal from employment. People's lives are on the line. This little lock, even if it's inconvenient and in the way, if they are trying to remove somebody else's lock, that's a fireable offense in a lot of companies. So just kind of keep that in mind. Disciplinary actions, nobody wants to talk about, kind of drawing that hard line. I think retraining goes a long way for a lot of things, but if they're going to be so blatant as to disregard someone's safety to the point that they're physically trying to, I think you get what I'm saying, but gotta think through where that line is for your company as well. Effective program and effective procedures, that's kind of a gray area. That's kind of subjective. That's where auditing comes into play. Assess the training, assess the workers, assess the procedures, see that anybody who needs to can actually read through and follow along with it. If it is so complex that people are getting confused or missing steps, or maybe you got it wrong. It happens. We're human. You wrote the step down in an opposite order than what actually makes sense whenever you get down to it. You got to review that stuff. You got to update it. Retrain people, monitor the program. That's important. People start to come up with their own little shortcuts, especially if they've done it enough times. They're like, oh, well, I don't really need to isolate this. Okay, but if that's part of your procedure, you should be doing it, or it needs to get reviewed. Get that feedback though. It's easy to say you have to do this, you have to do that, but if somebody's coming to you saying this is not reasonable, this piece of equipment has, other functions or mechanisms that we don't really need to isolate the whole thing, we can isolate this one portion of it for the simple and routine task, talk about that feedback. Don't overcomplicate something as long as you're not going to end up cutting corners on safety. And of course, document and manage those changes. As an employer, you have to document everything, otherwise it didn't happen, right? And we live in that kind of world. Okay, so the auditing piece, I kind of briefly talked about it. It is important. It is a regular thing, making sure that not only you have this stuff in place, but it is still effective and relevant to the workplace. So first up is the procedure evaluation. This does need to be done by an authorized person. It needs to be done by someone who understands this piece of equipment needs to be shut off in certain order with certain procedure for isolating or dissipating that energy. And then they compare. Does that procedure that's been written out actually apply to the equipment appropriately? This is going to be done every year. Okay, that sounds like a lot of work to go through and review your procedures every year. But that's what's required because things change. fixes are made, adjustments are made, renovations, adaptations to a machine's equipment, facility itself, you have to make sure that it's still applicable and able to be followed. There's nothing worse for an employee being told, hey, follow this procedure, and then they pull it up and they're like, that's not even the disconnect anymore. That's hard, that's difficult. Got to make sure that those changes are documented. There's also an annual hands-on assessment of authorized employees. Typically, I'm just going to say it, the procedure evaluation and the authorized employee evaluation can happen at the same time. But you'd have to have another person do this, but that way you can watch them apply the procedure, apply the locks, apply the devices, make sure that the procedure still works and that the employee knows how to do it properly. Okay, so authorized persons need to be reviewed and audited on an annual basis. I'll also note qualified electrical workers need this annual assessment as well. So if you have authorized employees that are also qualified, go ahead and add those additional things for qualified workers. Get it done at once. Combine these audits, make it easier on yourself. And then of course, if there's any change, you need to have that documented. There's also the program itself, the written policy documents and things like that need to have an audit, internal at least, to validate that it is still compliant. Again, the 70E updates every 3 years. Sometimes there could be changes that require you to add a little verbiage or change how you approach electrical lockout tagout. So for example, the 2024 version added some words as far as the verification of absence of voltage. Really, it was just to clarify what they meant, but it is still important. You have to verify absence of voltage at each point of work, where they're going to stick their hands, not just at the isolation device. Okay, because there could be backfeeds, there could be a secondary source. Just have to double check all that stuff. Anyway, little side tangent there, but you do still need to update, review at least, and possibly update that written document every year as well. Even if OSHA regulations don't update every year, there are other factors. Okay. So for the lockout tagout requirements, identifying all your sources, the order that they need to be locked out, the devices that need to be used, how to dissipate, all that stuff. To kind of summarize, first and foremost, authorized employees only are allowed to perform LOTO. That is why training is so important. That's why I've mentioned it so many times, because yes, your LOTO procedure should be written in a way that pretty much anybody could pick it up and follow along and understand it. But there's always that what if. There's always that maybe this doesn't work. Maybe this doesn't, follow the same way that you think it does. Or maybe there's been a change and they need to be able to identify that and work with that and let everyone know, not just, oh, well, it doesn't match up, skip that step, move on. Because skipping steps is what gets people killed. So don't ever skip any steps. Ensure equipment specific procedures are developed if you don't have them and followed. I've talked to a lot of companies that they've created the procedures and they've posted them or they keep them in a binder and they're very proud. They've spent a lot of time working on developing these and making them really great resources. And then I talk to the employees, the authorized employees, and I ask them where their procedures are, and they're like, oh yeah, they're somewhere around here, but I've do it so many times, I don't need it anymore. I'm like, well, has anything changed in the last year with this piece of equipment? I just kind of bring an example into play. And they're like, well, yeah, we had to refeed this, and now this valve broke, so we put in a splice or whatever. All kinds of things get changed over the course of a year or two. And I'm like, okay, so has that procedure been updated? Oh, probably not. Have you told anyone that there's been change? Oh, no, I didn't think to. So go review them, make sure that they're up to date and able to be followed, because maybe that one authorized employee knows what they're doing and they are solid, but what if they call in sick and someone else needs to work on it? What are you going to do? How are they going to be able to apply those LOTO procedures? Only use designated locks for lockout. Okay, so no master locks, no toolbox locks, no personal locks. It is a lockout specific device. Best practice is to always use locks and tags together. Like I said, there are some scenarios, some industries where a lock isn't able to be used. It's pretty rare. Most of the time, safe bet, just use them both together, because then the tag has room for that person to write their name, a date, contact information, maybe even On the back, there's room for some notes as far as like why it's locked out or how long it's going to be locked out for estimate, things like that. Definitely need to perform risk assessments. Minor servicing is overused. See, people try to say, oh, well, we're going to set up this equipment before operation, and so we don't really need to lock it out because it's simple and routine, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, but you're still putting your body or your hands into the danger zone, so no, you do need to still lock it out. There's some nuance there. Never apply or remove a lock for another person. In our electrical safety training, we have an example of this, and it's a story from a gentleman talking about his experience being in an arc flash. He was trained by somebody. He was trained wrong because his mentor locked it out for him, and he was more focused on teaching him how to do that task. And so whenever he went back to do the task again, he didn't know that he had to lock it out himself. He thought, well, I was assigned this task. It must already be locked out because that's what happened last time. Never allow someone to work under another person's lock. It's just, maybe it's okay that time, but the next time it could be a disaster. That gentleman did end up passing away. He recorded his video and then later his injuries came back. So participate in annual audits of programs and procedures. So making sure that, again, the workers know what they're doing, they're applying it appropriately, and that it all still applies, and retrain when necessary. So this is another thing. Yeah, technically retraining is every 3 years at a minimum per the 70E, but if you see somebody skipping steps, or if you see someone trying to reach in before it's actually properly locked out, or you see someone that's getting to work without notifying employees that it's back up and running, go ahead and retrain. Make sure that that's kind of avoided in the future. I'll just leave it there. Okay. How to start? If you've already got a lot of this stuff covered, fantastic. If you're like, oh, there's some missing aspects, or we haven't reviewed things in a while, let's figure out a little checklist basically of how to get started revamping or improving your lockout tagout program. First and foremost, audit those programs. Make sure that what you say in those written documents are still relevant and actually applicable, that they're actually being used. Even if you have a solid written policy, if people aren't reading it or haven't been able to understand it, how can they follow it effectively? And then make sure those equipment specific procedures are actually created and accurate. Again, things change. Don't assume that it all still applies. You might be surprised how many procedures out there still have quote unquote assumed or skipped steps. In other words, well, of course you have to do XYZ before the next piece. No, write it out. Supply the appropriate lockout tagout devices that are applicable to the isolation points on each equipment. So I'm sorry, but a lock by itself or lock and tag by themselves aren't going to actually block people from turning back on every type of isolation point. For example, valves. A lot of times you need another device put in place. So make sure you have them. And train anyone who works on or near hazardous energy. Make it very clear who is authorized versus who is affected, and don't allow people to cross those lines without proper training and approval. Of course, if you need help, we've got you covered. We have a whole bunch of different services and solutions, consulting, training, whatever you need, we can help you out. Just let us know. Understanding what's required and why is always the first step in achieving compliance, but more importantly, it's the first step to making sure you and your workers are going home safely. Okay, with about 10 minutes to spare, which is rare because usually there's a lot more back and forth because I have a partner in crime of some sort to talk through this stuff, but we've got 10 minutes. If you have any questions or want to dive into a topic a little bit more thoroughly, again, this was a high level 1 hour overview of applying lockout tagout standards. So by all means, find that question feature or the chat feature, type in your response, and we will dive in. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending the webinar today. Don't forget to download the handout on the handout tab, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one. Okay, got a question here. Is there any time that using PPE such as rubber gloves is not needed? How do you know when PPE is needed? Okay, for the electrical specifically, since that's what's brought up, it's about exposure. So there are times where you're opening up equipment and you're not working on electrical, but the electrical components are exposed, 50 volts and greater. You're still within those hazard boundaries. So you would need to verify that it's off with the proper PPE before getting to work. If you can't do that, then technically you would have to keep the PPE on, the electrical PPE on, until the work is completed. Now, mind you, that's whenever you're within the boundaries. However, there are times where you can isolate or turn off that power, shut it, lock it out, disconnect switch, for example, and you open a compartment to service, and there aren't any electrical components that are exposed. You can't see or touch any electrical parts. There is nothing requiring you to verify absence of voltage at that point because you're not interacting with electrical components. That's the difference. Are you exposed or not? Are all commercial properties required to have arc flash studies, including small office buildings? Simple answer is yes. If you have three-phase power at any point, yes, there's no doubt about it, there's going to be a study. Even if it's just that main electrical room. Our office, for example, we're not a huge mega corporation facility with a bunch of manufacturing and all that stuff. No, we're an office building with cubicles and offices and lights, but we have three-phase power. So yes, you have to have that study completed. Because there's always a chance for an arc flash in those environments. Single phase still can have an arc flash, and some unique systems can. So I would recommend just having a conversation if you're not sure about that. Standard, typically not, but anything 208 and above for sure. Should anyone that take LOTO training always take 70E training as well? Good question. It kind of goes hand in hand with my response to whether or not they need PPE. If they're ever going to have to put on electrical PPE, absolutely. They need to have that training specific to the 70E work practices as well. If they do not open anything that has electrical components, then they just need hazard awareness training, avoidance training, making sure that they don't accidentally open the wrong compartment. Is there a specific code I can reference to justify the work? Oh, for the NFPA 70E, yes. So there's, I have like a little 5-minute slide deck that lays out, OSHA regulations, 70E references, and how it applies to your workplace. I don't want to call out a specific reference right now and get a subparagraph wrong or something. So Brian, I'll make a note to follow up and send you that little 5-minute overview of why you need an arc flash study to be in compliance. Does OSHA require documentation of when something is locked out? Good question, Bill. So when you are going to be locking out or servicing procedures or servicing equipment using procedures, and there is potential exposure to hazardous energy, there should be some kind of job safety plan performed ahead of time. So in that regard, yes, the type and extent of it is going to vary widely. Most of the time I see it's just you have identified, you've got the procedure, those are the isolation points, here's who's involved, I am trained, here's what we're going to be doing with it, and that everyone understands what to do safely. Is there a deadline to have the study completed, and is it the same for all states? Lori, are you talking about the arc flash study, I think? And so arc flash studies have been required for many years now. And there's not necessarily a specific deadline, but all states do fall within that OSHA and NFPA requirement. And Lori also wants the slide. Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody else wants it, by all means, just let me know. 5-minute explanation of why you need an arc flash study to be in compliance. It's not I do like to touch base on the fact that it saves lives, because it does, but the compliance side of it, what codes or standards specifically get cited from OSHA or whoever that say, yes, you need an arc flash study. 5-minute little slide deck, I can send it to you. Just let me know in those comments, but I've got 2 people already I will send it to. And there's my email, by the way, on the screen for you. Okay, yep, we've got a few more people now saying that they want the 5-minute. I'll go back through, yep, I see you, I see you. I will go back through this. There's a record of these comments. I'll make sure to get your email from your registration and send it to you all as well. I might just send it to the whole group, just keep it simple. So sorry if you get an email and you didn't want it, but you're gonna get it. I'd rather people have those kind of resources and not need it than be like, oh, it would be great if we had XYZ and never see something like that. Okay, well, I'm gonna close out the webinar in just a couple more minutes. If you have, oh, it just keeps coming in. I should have brought this up way sooner, that we have this little 5-minute explanation of why you need to study. I feel like that's a way underutilized resource now, my bad. If you have any other questions or comments, concerns, feedback, by all means, go ahead and send it. Otherwise, you can shoot me an email, cwininger@herzigengineering.com. You can call the office and tell them to stop letting Caitlyn do webinars. No, I'm just kidding. It's all good. Just feel free to reach out anytime you need anything. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of fade into the background unless any other questions come up. Thank you so much for coming, guys.